This is a Film Stories original podcast. We made this.
Welcome to the X-Cast. The truth is in here. I'm going to be your host for today. I'm Russ Hugo. I'm sitting in for Tony Black. And with me, because it's a mythology episode, none other than Darren Mooney. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing good. How are you doing, Russ?
Well, I'm getting to chat about a mythology episode with thee, so I am doing fabulously. And I cannot wait to get into this. But I'm assuming you've already talked about Redux 1 with Tony?
I have indeed. So last week we talked a little bit about Redux 1, which is interesting because I think Tony originally had planned to do Redux 1 and Redux 2 as a kind of a bumper mythology episode of themselves, but then sat down, watched Redux 1, figured there was enough stuff in here, ironically most of which involving the question of the mechanics of Mulder's shotgun blast to the face, but a lot of stuff in there that was very worth unpacking and discussing of itself, and so kind of split it up and thought that the two episodes deserved their own space, and I think that's fair as well, because I think I think the entire trilogy is 3 very different episodes, but I think Redux 1 and Redux 2 are also very different episodes from one another while existing as part of the whole, if that makes sense.
It does, and I think IMDb agrees with you on that point. So, yeah, first of all, the disclaimers, I have not heard Darren and Tony's podcast on Redux 1, so hopefully I won't cover any additional ground, and I'll rely on your expertise, Darren, to steer us away from boring redundancies. But then transitioning to that, do you already know what the score is for Redux 2 on IMDb?
Don't. I was very, very proud of myself last week when I guessed down to the decimal place what the score was for Redux 1. I think it was 8.8, right? So I have no idea what the score is for Redux 2. If I were to guess, I would say, I'm going to go out on a limb, I'm going to say the consensus on Redux 2 is stronger than on Redux 1. I think that there's a lot more material in here for X-Files fans, in that there's a lot more interactions between Mulder and Scully for the shippers. There's a lot more Mulder versus kind of CSM for the people who are invested in, the myth arc and the character dynamics. There's a lot more dynamism and sort of emotional heft, and there's even like that nice suspenseful beat with this, with the sniper rifle being set up across the way from the apartment. So I think that this is going to edge up. I'm tempted to go 9.1 on this one, and I wonder if I'm too low.
Just by a hair. I mean, you gotta get it. I mean, there's always a little bit of wiggle room. 9.2. Oh, I wish we had prizes we could give you, because that's exceptional.
Well, the prize is getting to talk about the episode with you, Russ. That's the prize.
Jeez, and now the tears, oh my gosh, welling up the emotions. Oh, boy. Well, before we get into it, let's just get the other boring stuff out of the way. That this was Season 5, Episode 3, originally aired in November 9th in 1997. That's 22 years.
Make you feel old,
by Kim
right?
Manners. Oh, I don't need this episode to do that, but it helps. It really does. It's demoralizing. Thanks a lot, X-Files. We could go about this a few different ways. I organized some notes and just kind of would prop some things and see what you're interested in discussing. I thought instead of going scene by scene, there's kind of groups of things to talk about. Like Scully's cancer and her family, with Mulder's response. We have the Cure, CSM Melissa, that arc, the Assassin arc, the Review Committee, and the horse racing, human genome cloning, and Skinner's trust angle.
I love that. There's you've got all the very specific categories. At the end, there's just almost everything else.
The wild card. Yeah.
Which I think that's probably the best way to talk about this again, because that's the way that Carter almost kind of writes. In that we talked about this with Tony last week, where Carter isn't always a propulsive mythology writer, particularly when he doesn't have, say, Frank Spotnitz or Howard Gordon, if going back to the third season, kind of working with him, kind of providing that sense of like forward momentum. So I think that going almost theme by theme through a Carter episode is probably the best way to do it, or the way to kind of like bite off the most stuff, I think.
Well, just so you know, it is Darren's choice. So which theme would you like to start with today?
There's a board.
There is, yeah. For The Cure for 200.
Let's take The Cure for 200.
Okay, let's do it. So we've got, under this plot line, we have, of course, CSM offering, well, not only the initial reveal about the microchip, but also trying to recruit Mulder and the encounter with Melissa. I'll open it up just by the random quote of Tabasco cures anything. Darren, what are your thoughts on this general arc, and what hits you? What strikes you?
Well, I mean, okay, well, first of all, myself and Tony spent a lot of time last week having a good deal of fun at the expense of the resolution to the fourth season cliffhanger, with Chekhov's pump-action shotgun. And, Tony was very kind of cynical about it. I was maybe a little bit more forgiving of it, because I do think stuff like the shotgun was set up beforehand. But it was very much a bit of a cheeky out, where it's like, well, there's a body in Mulder's apartment, but it's not actually Mulder's body, and logically, in order to do that, he had to, shoot a guy in the face and then shoot him again in the face with a shotgun. How exactly does all that work? And it's not the most elegant of cliffhanger reveals between the fourth and fifth seasons. But that said, the cliffhanger reveal between these two episodes always kind of, I like Redux 2 a lot. I like Redux 2 a lot more than I like Redux 1. But the cliffhanger reveal has always been a little bit much for me, which is the lone gunman, pour out the deionized water, and they're like, well, there's no cure here. And it turns out that actually they didn't just check in the bottom of the container, because that's where the microchip was. That's always been I'm not a plot guy. I'm not a plot hole guy. I'm not a guy who points at episodes and goes, well, that doesn't really make sense if you think about it. But that always was just a little bit much for me as far as cliffhanger resolutions go.
I can't argue with that at all. It is drove me nuts. You have something that's so small, and they have all this analysis equipment.
Yeah.
And just, okay, well, it's...
That's why you always have to get 180 degrees.
Yeah. Shake it a little bit. Tap the top. I mean, come on. Especially when you're talking about ketchup and condiments and Tabasco later. I mean, there's something happening. It just comes too late in the narrative.
But no,
I'm with you on that. It does bug. That is one thing that does bug me. I'm forgiving in the sense of just this story has so many things going on that hey, it distracts me.
That said, I like
reptile brain,
and I say that despite that, that's probably about as cynical as I'm going to be for a little while when talking about this episode, because there's a lot that I really, really like about it. And since you mentioned The Cure, right? Let's start with The Cure, because I really like how weirdly, open-endedly ambiguous the episode is about the nature of Scully's cure here. I mean, is it the chip that was put back in her neck? Because that doesn't initially seem to be making her better. Is it Mulder's faith in her? Is it God? Is it prayer? Is it something else that we don't even see happening on or off screen? Is the syndicate involved? There's all these open-ended questions, and I quite like that the episode is quite transparently open about the fact that there is no closure here, that there's no one magic bullet that happened to put Scully's cancer into remission. I mean, Mulder and Skinner have that conversation at the end where Mulder effectively says, we'll never know what cured Scully's cancer, what put it into remission here. I think that's a surprisingly brave way of ending a plot line that's been running through, that's bridged the two seasons, because obviously Scully announced that her cancer had come back at the end of the fourth season. That had been hanging over the summer, and obviously at the end of Redux 1 you had her bleeding through her nose onto the files, which was again made it much more urgent, and here you've had her in hospital for pretty much the entire episode. I really liked that Carter, and this is something that I think speaks to the strength of the themes of the three episodes, but that Carter was willing to leave that dangling out there without providing a detailed kind of bullet point synopsis, footnoted explanation for what was happening, because I think, people talk about the X-Files, the mythology not really making sense, which has never been a fair criticism to me. In fact, I'd argue almost the opposite. I think the problem with some of the mythology developments as the show went on was that it went into too much depth and went into, tried to be too precise and too specific. And even things like, say, the truth at the end of the 9th season, which was arguably just a Chris Carter PowerPoint saying, see, I told you it makes sense. I like that Redux 2, at the start of the 5th season, at the point at which the show is at the height of its popularity, the point at which everybody's watching, the point at which, we're building up to a movie, the show is willing to do something that violates a lot of the accepted norms of storytelling, because you're conditioned to expect setup and payoff in a very linear, very direct, very kind of laid out and explained to you fashion. I like that the episode is open-ended, although I worry now that you're going to contradict me and come down. Russ, what do you think about that? Do you think that there is something that specifically cures her cancer? Do you think that it is ambiguous and open-ended? And do you think that's a good thing?
Mostly, I'd like to address the fact that I am presupposed to be such a contrarian. I'm worried about my what I have done on this podcast. How many horrible discourse crimes I've committed. But I guess to your surprise, I think it is. I completely agree. I think it's the strongest part of the episode for me. It also is surprising to me that this is a similar thread they've done so many times, both with the mythology, in the sense of you don't know what's going to happen. X-Files always leaves things unresolved with one breath, and everything else. It has this nebulous feel of what's really at play here. And they resolve it that way again, and it not only works dramatically, I think it also lends it authenticity. Yeah. I think there is some thing to the nebulousness of cancer and cancer treatments that's a hard thing to describe. You've got so many treatments, you have so many odds, so many unknowns, and I think it's a wonderful way to present it. And then at the end, you just kind of have to accept that, both in nature and also in the film, and it works well dramatically. Yeah. Darren, I'm sorry to say this, because I guess I'm just breaking nature, but I couldn't agree more.
I know, it's very strange when that happens. It's very, very uncomfortable. But no, that's the thing about it. Narratively, it shouldn't really work, because you've had Mulder, crawling through the DOD looking for a cure to Scully's cancer. You've had the cancer sort of built up as this threat. It's been, developed through the 4th season, through Memento Mori, through Gethsemane, arguably even in episodes like Zero Sum. It is a big deal, narratively speaking, thematically speaking. There's a lot of weight hinging on it. And to resolve something with that much weight on it by, and again, being flippant and saying shrugging your shoulders, it doesn't shrug its shoulders. The entire point is that these things exist outside of our capacity to understand. It's a very brave storytelling choice, and it's something that really works. And, I say that as somebody who has at times been very frustrated with directions in which Carter has taken the show and sort of ways in which over the course of the show, and Tony and I talked about this with Redux 1, probably not going to go into it too much here, but the sense in which the show could end up almost eating its own tail, going round in circles, and there are aspects of that we'll come to in Redux 2. But here, I like the idea that not knowing something doesn't diminish your faith. In fact, actually, it enriches your faith. But it also doesn't belittle the experience of it, which is something that's very true to the entire 3-parter, because Gethsemane, which is the 4th season finale leading into this, and which is the episode of the 3 that I love the most, is an episode that is, as the title implies, very much about doubt, about uncertainty, about not questioning the things or the truths that you have believed all the way through. And what would seem, narratively speaking, or logically, or organically, particularly in the context of the show, the right way, in inverted commas, to end this episode would be to reveal that Mulder's faith was vindicated and justified, and that he was right all along. And so there's something I quite like about this in the way in which it leaves it open-ended, because it becomes something that is, and again, I worry I'm sounding very pretentious, something that's much more profound. Because, throughout the X-Files, again, this is probably, we're going to branch out into, talking about bigger themes within the 3-parter and the show and the 5th season as a whole. But within the show, you have this idea of Mulder and Scully's faith being kind of central to what the X-Files is. And in the Gethsemane trilogy, or the Redux trilogy, you have this idea of questioning what that faith actually means. And one of the things that I really like about the Redux trilogy is that Carter makes it quite clear that Mulder's faith isn't actually in the specifics of the mythology. It isn't in this idea of colonization or the black oil or this countdown to, Armageddon. It isn't in the specifics of the mythology, the conspiracy, the consortium, the syndicate, all that sort of stuff. Mulder's faith is just in the truth. It's in this idea that there is a truth out there, possibly, that there is a way for this to make sense. And it gets around some of the issues that, have kind of haunted the show. And I think you and I have talked about this briefly in the past. I think when we talked about like Kaddish in the fourth season. But when we were talking about like things like the questionable legacy of some of the show, where you have this paranoia and this kind of conspiratorial mindset within the X-Files, where people like Ingu Kang are kind of writing and wondering what the legacy of that is in 2016. How far are Mulder's beliefs from, the beliefs of people who believe in things like, say, Pizzagate, to pick an example? How far away are those kind of mythology episodes from that level of paranoia, and where that paranoia has taken popular culture and internet culture and fringe culture in the past couple of years? And what I really like about the Redux trilogy, Gethsemane and Redux 2 in particular, and Redux 2 because what we just talked about there with Scully's cancer not having a clear kind of delineated simple explanation for its remission, is the idea of kind of at its purest getting back to Mulder believes not in the particulars of a conspiracy theory. Mulder just believes that there is a truth that exists beyond what authorities, what people in authority, what institutions have told him is the truth. And that, therefore, is comparable to Scully's religious faith, which is simply a source of strength. And that it's possible in Redux 2, in a way that, isn't always the case throughout the show's run, to reconcile the two with one another. It's entirely possible that Scully was healed by a microchip that was developed by the government that Mulder stole from a conspiracy of men who were working on secret cloning experiments, and working towards alien colonization. But it's also equally possible that Scully was healed by her belief in God, her faith, her religious hope. And it's not the particulars of the belief system that matter, so much as the actual belief itself. And there's something very kind of beautiful in that, and something very, I think, and again, I worry that I'm overusing the word brave in describing this trilogy, but very brave for Carter to do in the context of, the X-Files being at the peak of its popularity, and people wanting it to be as accessible as ever, and wanting to reduce it down to, what we would today call memeability, but to its core essence. I think there's something very striking in that. What about you, Russ?
Wonderfully put. One of the things I took away that I find to be very beautiful as well, and I'd be curious to get your take on this, and I think it hints at some things you've mentioned before, and also some things we talked about, talking about Millennium, and how I think there's some refreshing things about Carter's protagonists and the way of changing some of the narrative arcs and the character development flow, and taking your protagonist like Mulder, who could be coded as very action-oriented, and the arc is basically, again, learning to just accept, and learning to accept that he can't change this and can't control it, similar with One Breath. Yeah. And to be able to redo that, but do it in a way that still feels real, and it still feels fresh, and it feels like when he comes out the end this time, that there is a little bit more growth that was building on, again, what happened in One Breath. And I find that to be an interesting journey for Mulder to go on, and to present to television that way, that this is...
And a season premiere.
Yeah. I don't mean to cut to the end, but one line I really loved from the episode is when, right before he goes to the review committee, he goes to visit Scully, and she says, "So why did you come here if you already made up your mind?" He said, "Because I knew you'd talk me out of it if I was making a mistake." Now, that's just such a wonderfully subtle way to sum up their character relationship, the X-Files and the rest. But that's the big pep talk. I mean, that's the big drama. And just it's downplayed so much. And a lot of the presentation of the cancer could be, in other television shows, I think, dramatized in ways that they really use a considerable amount of restraint, whether it's the makeup, whether it's the lighting, and just allowing Scully and Mulder to both present their emotions in ways it feels quite laudable, is something I'm going to say. Or I'll go with brave on that end, too, because they could have easily milked this out for in-your-face visceral emotions. And that kind of goes back with the faith aspect and with the intangible cure, that there aren't these really deep, like, oh, if you'll die, I'll lose everything, character moments between the two. And a lot of them have to do it in isolation. And it feels pretty real. And I don't know, it really struck a chord with me this time watching it.
It really did. And actually, just to go back to something that you said there, because I think this is something that's interesting. And again, to provide a kind of a counterpoint to something I talked about with Tony last week, where when we talked about how a lot of the Redux trilogy is essentially kind of retreading old ground. So you have another sense of like, oh, is Skinner trustworthy? For the, third, fourth, fifth time at this point? Or, is Scully going back into hospital while Mulder sort of like runs around and does action stuff, which you've already had in, say, One Breath or Memento Mori. I think what's interesting about the Redux trilogy, and again, this is the thing where I'm going to pivot from what was a criticism when I talked about with Tony to something that I actually do really like and I think works really well about it, is that, like, we talked about how this is an episode that is written by Carter completely by himself, but at the same time, you can see him kind of appropriating or kind of incorporating the work of writers who have worked under him into the show. And I'm, like, one of the things that I really like about the X-Files is the sense in which every writer working on the X-Files has their own version of the show. And it's all slightly different. So if you watch Darren Morgan's episodes back to back, it's like watching a mini-series. Or if you watch James Morgan and Glenn Wong's, you've got their own distinct view of what the show is about or what it's handling. But even more subtly with like people like Vince Gilligan or Howard Gordon, all the writers kind of have their own angle on the show. And Carter has his own as well, to be absolutely clear. And one of the things that I like about Redux, which I really, really appreciate, and it's particularly obvious in Redux II, is the sense in which Carter seems to be, at the start of the 5th season, going back and kind of looking at the stuff that other people have done with the show, which was nominally his idea, something that he created, something that, he started from the ground up and then incorporated a kind of a bunch of writers and brought them in and allowed them to kind of take risks and to do in their own way. And to see him kind of like applying his own slant to those ideas. So, like, you have, for example, you mentioned One Breath, which is a Glenn Morgan, James Wong episode. And to a certain extent, it feels like, Gethsemane and Redux is allowing Carter to do his own version of One Breath, through his own Carters and through his own lens. Most obviously in Redux 2, you have him doing a scene which owes a great deal to Darren Morgan. You mentioned the Tabasco kind of sequence, but the diner there, that sequence recalls obviously, the Jose Chung's From Outer Space, the famous diner sequence in that episode, which is layered with ambiguity and nobody has any idea what's really happening in there. But even like you could argue the kind of the whole theme of the 3-parter, which is like, we have no idea what is actually true, and we have no idea of discerning, what's actually going on. It could all be fake, it could all be a hoax, but then it could all be, we could all be lured into thinking that's a hoax to disguise the fact that it's true. It's all postmodernism, which is very, again, influenced by Darren Morgan's work on Jose Chung's From Outer Space. And I really like that aspect of Redux, particularly Redux 2, where you can see, it's almost as if Carter's looking at the work that other people have done with what started as his idea and kind of saying, actually, that's really good. I want to fold that into my version of what the X-Files is. And I really like that, particularly on rewatching Redux and Gethsemane, where you have the kind of context of the larger show around it to provide a kind of a framing device, and you get a sense of how truly odd these 3 episodes are in the context of the show. I really, really like that aspect of it. Well, was that just me? Am I the only kind of, am I possibly reading too much into it? Or did you get that sense as well? Were you also kind of reminded of Darren Morgan in places and Glenn Morgan and James Wong in others?
I could lie and say, yes, I had that nuanced of an interpretation. But no, I have not drunk enough decaf to muster up that. But I think it's a wonderful interpretation.
Sugar.
Oh, is it sugar? Well, either...
Sugar and Tabasco.
That's right. I'm woefully unprepared. But no, that makes sense. There's a real jambalaya, a real stew of plot lines here that are summing together into something that it's shocking that it works as well as it does. They give you some resolutions, and they give you none in some of the main plot line with Scully, but I wonder if that's one of the reasons it helps sell the Scully Ambiguity 2 is because they finally do give some degree of resolution through a scene that I kind of wanted to discuss with you in this final review committee confrontation with Mulder, and how that's like a proto-truth. And it works really well there as a way to quickly sum up some things, and then I wonder if Carter, from this experience then later, said, oh boy, we should do Redux 2 again. But we can't call it Redux 3. So,
we should do that whole thing. Well, I mean, myself and Tony talked about how there's a lot of Redux in My Struggle, in the 4 My Struggles, particularly in the way that Carter sort of rewrites his own mythology. It's kind of interesting that you could say that the review committee hearing probably did influence sort of the choices that he made with the truth later on, where he's like, yep, laying out the entire mythology is probably a good direction and a good way to go. I actually really like that sequence. Well, first of all, it's really, really well kind of shot and edited by Kim Manners, who's taking over for R.W. Goodwin this week, and is really, really great. And again, it's a thing where you have that influence of 70s cinema that kind of runs through the X-Files. And, it's not ignored, it's not necessarily under-discussed, but it is something that you really, really love to see. So you have stuff like, say, the Jose Chung reference to Star Wars in its opening shot, the allusions to all the, Close Encounters of the Third Kind that happen throughout the show. But here you have them doing the ending of The Godfather, pretty much, in that sequence where you have Mulder kind of going in and addressing the committee, and it's being sort of, intercut with the sequence of the sniper rifle with Quiet Willie leaning out the car park, and, then you have Blevin sort of arriving in his office, looking like he's taken all of the non-decaffeinated coffee that you can imagine. But you have this kind of wonderful, sort of very cinematic way of delivering, what is a Carter monologue, where you have the building of Mark Snow's score around it. You have the intercutting as Mulder kind of builds up momentum. You have David Duchovny, who's on really, really fine form this episode. Whether he's... And again, you mentioned those wonderful scenes with Scully, which are relatively underplayed by the standards of kind of, what you might expect from melodramatic sort of soap opera. One of our characters has cancer, and the other one is kind of dealing with kind of guilt and shame and kind of responsibility that they might feel for that. It's very, underplayed on the page, but Duchovny really, really brings it. That sequence of him where he visits Scully at night while she's asleep and he's crying. I think I've said it before on the podcast, and it remains true. There are very few people on television who can cry like David Duchovny. And he really, really, really gives it socks. But yeah, that sequence with the committee where he's sort of getting ready to, j'accuse, is astounding. Just as a piece of kind of mounting tension and suspense. And again, it's one of those things that fits with Carter's recurring preoccupations. And again, I think we mentioned this, we may have discussed, you and I, the idea of evil and kind of how it reflects through Carter's work, particularly in the context of Millennium. We kind of had the discussion recently. But even in Redux, you see that playing out kind of in the moral dilemma that's presented to Mulder, where the cigarette-smoking man who's, depending on how he's written, as Carter has generally seen him as a kind of a Luciferian kind of figure, where he's this kind of like fallen angel, this dark, tempting force. You can see it, for example, in Zero Sum, where he's this corrupting influence on Walter Skinner, who gets him to do these horrible things for what Skinner believes to be the greater good, but which, Redux 1 and Redux 2, in hindsight, revealed that everything that Skinner was doing for the cigarette-smoking man had made absolutely no difference because it didn't stop Scully's cancer coming back. And here you have, the cigarette-smoking man presenting Mulder with the exact same offer. And again, this is all biblical stuff. Like Gethsemane is that moment of doubt that Jesus has, before the Passion. This is, equivalent to Satan showing up and kind of offering Jesus, saying he can make him king, taking him up and showing him, the world and saying all this can be yours. All you have to do is just follow me. You have the cigarette-smoking man making similar sort of offers to Mulder, where he's like, I will give you back your sister. I will give you a cure to Scully's cancer. All you have to do is just give me something in return. And that little deal with the devil is that compromise. And again, this is the thing where the plotting isn't necessarily watertight in terms of plot. There's a lot of ambiguity there, but I think that it works in part because Carter knows the ambiguity is there and leans into it, but also because the themes of the episode kind of make that ambiguity seem like a feature rather than a bug. But like the sequence where, Mulder has been directed by Blevins to point the finger at Skinner in that meeting, which is in itself kind of a metaphorical reflection of the deal with the devil that he's been offered by the cigarette-smoking man, which is like, I can cure Scully's cancer, I can make your problems go away, if you just make this little compromise for me, if you give me this little something. And again, this goes back to like, Carter's version of evil as espoused even in Anasazi, where Bill Mulder talked about how, once you throw in with them, once your politics become their politics, they have you. You're bought and paid for. And you have this idea of evil in Redux 1 and Redux 2, which is very, very biblical, very old-fashioned, and very kind of rigorous, which I kind of like. There's a moral certainty to Carter's writing, which shines through, I would argue across his work, but in Redux 1 and Redux 2 in particular, that works really well because it feels, and again, this gets back to that ambiguity, because it feels genuinely spiritual. It feels like it's not a literal case of kind of, like signing a contract or kind of like making, sort of being complicit in a literal sense. It's more being complicit in a vague sense by allowing yourself to be complicit, by allowing yourself to be compromised, which I find very effective for that ambiguity, because it's not a direct linear kind of causation. It's not like the cigarette-smoking man says, I will cure Scully's cancer if you point at Skinner. Instead, it's a kind of a confluence of events that kind of come together to offer that, that almost opportunity to compromise to Mulder, that opportunity to make some of his suffering go away, to kind of lay down his burdens, and to take the easy path. And I really like that aspect of this episode. And again, I understand that might drive some people mad, but what about you? Was that, like, is there a theme of good and evil in here? Does this fit with your kind of understanding of Carter's kind of work, or is the ambiguity maybe a bit too vague for you? Is there too much going on with a cigarette-smoking man trying to corrupt Mulder at the same time that Blevins is offering him an out, or do they kind of play together, or do they kind of contrast? How do they work for you, Russ?
Well, I'd like to take what you just explored and maybe push one more thing in here for you to get your analysis on. So the Blevins angle I like contrasted with the CSM angle. And the Blevins angle, the language is very much, I'm trying to protect you, I'm trying to help you. There's a mirroring of this trinity of sorts between Blevins, Skinner, and CSM. And one thing I think I found rewatching it very appealing is the way, very subtly, it attempts to add some ambiguity into CSM's motivation. And the fact that Carter is writing the people above him, including Blevins, in a much more stark relief in contrast to CSM, to give him just a little bit of ambiguity, including the photo at the end with the blood, and to say really what are his motivations, and that he has tried to cover for Mulder multiple times, and there's this roguish intent. I thought that was very effective to kind of take this character that is, attempting Luciferian thing, as you state, but then to add in the back of your head, maybe some of his intentions are genuine, and how much is he doing because he's having to protect himself also from the people above him. So it's I don't know, what are your thoughts?
I like that. I like that aspect of the kind of CSM. And again, like, this is the thing where you talk about Carter kind of almost in Redux kind of appropriating elements from other writers' kind of work on the show, or the writers' visions of the show. There's a lot of musings of a cigarette-smoking man in here, for example. And that ambiguity, I would argue, is part of that. But even like the shot of Quiet Willie setting up the sniper rifle, whenever I see that, I think of the teaser to Musings of a Cigarette-Smoking Man, where the cigarette-smoking man sets up a rifle, to stare down Frohickey. So you have that kind of ironic juxtaposition of the cigarette-smoking man being placed on the opposite end of the rifle between those two episodes, which I think is very effective. And this gets at the ambiguity that I quite like here, because again, I'm kind of curious about my read of the episode, and I kind of want to get your read on this as well. And again, sometimes with the X-Files, you can get kind of bogged down in the details and the plot specifics and stuff like that, and it's not necessarily productive to do that, and it's kind of wondering who knows what when. Can be a fun exercise, but it can also kind of lead to dead ends. I'm kind of curious about this with the cigarette smoking man, right? So in Redux 1, when he thinks Mulder's dead and he goes to visit Mulder's apartment, and it's a lovely little moment from William B. Davis, and there's a little tear, and he takes the photo, and it's very clear that he does have an emotional attachment to Mulder. He does love Mulder as much as he's capable of loving anything that is not an extension of himself. Perhaps he only loves Mulder because he sees himself as an extension of himself, but there is a sense of genuine emotion there, a sense of genuine loss there. And again, that's arguably something that goes back to his revival of Mulder's mother at the start of the 4th season, where there's a sense of is he doing this for himself or for his own feelings for Tina as much as he's doing it for the reasons that he offers, the alien bounty hunter, about, a man who has nothing left to lose is a real threat, etc., etc. But what I'm wondering is, he notices the bugging device in the ceiling. He goes to the First Elder, and he asks about having Mulder under surveillance. And the First Elder says to him, if this is happening at the DOD, I was not informed of this. And I think this is a deliberate ambiguity, but I'm curious to make what you think of this. Is the First Elder lying to the cigarette-smoking man, given that, later on in the episode, we see that he has very little patience for him, and that, the cigarette-smoking man has effectively been given enough rope to hang himself? Or is the First Elder being honest, and is there is the conspiracy more fractured and kind of contrarian and kind of wild and kind of decentralized as compared to we've kind of come to think of it since around the 3rd season? And then sort of related to that, and again, this is where I'm going out on a limb, and I'm not entirely sure how much of this is just me kind of trying to be contrarian, or trying to kind of work through the angles on what the show is actually telling us visually with its storytelling versus what it's actually articulating in dialogue. But the sequence with Blevins at the end, where he is killed by the credited senior agent, the character who doesn't even get a name, the character who is sitting down at his extension taking a phone call. Are we supposed to read from that Blevins was always the First Elder's man inside the FBI? Or that Blevins was working for Rausch, which is kind of something that exists tangentially related to the First Elder's kind of conspiracy, and that the senior agent who was on the phone, before he shoots Blevins, was he the man that the First Elder talks about being their man in the FBI, because he uses the singular. He doesn't say our men, which would imply that, Blevins and the senior agent are working together. He says our man as if to imply only one of them is working for him. So is it possible to read it in that light, that the kind of the mythology is kind of being deliberately kind of fractured and left ambiguous, and these sort of elements are kind of playing off one another? Or am I, making a mountain of a molehill? Is it as simple as it sounds? Is the First Elder, always in control, always in charge of everything, and, happens to have Blevins there working for him, but also the senior agent as a backup, in case this stuff hits the fan like it eventually does? What do you make of that, Russ?
I don't know if I could add anything more to that, in the sense that your analysis makes a lot of sense. I'm going to cut to the chase. I like the ambiguity, and I like that it's not clear, and the twist at the end where the senior agent kills Blevins, like you're saying, what is the connection? Is the connection to Rausch? And then how does it connect back there? I wish that the show did more of this, and that's one thing I really like about Redux 2, is it adds more questions as opposed to answering things, as opposed to explaining this is exactly what the Syndicate is and what it looks like. But going back to your first question about CSM, I took away from it through multiple plot lines, but especially by the time we get to Redux 2, that the Syndicate / the First Elder is very skeptical of CSM and not buying what he's selling. Hence, when he sends the assassin online, I think that worked pretty well. One thing I really liked storytelling-wise that relates to what you're talking about, be good to get your opinion on, is the First Elder makes this mention while he's watching the stuff about the Human Genome Project and sees Skinner in the audience of the tape, of the broadcast, and then it implies, because of the way things unfold, that they contacted Blevins, and then Blevins then tells Mulder to rat out Skinner. But we don't see that happen. And you could read it, at that point if you don't know what's going on with Skinner or anything else. And I thought that was a nice, clever way. That reading it backwards, it's pretty clear. But while you're watching it, it's a very elegant way to set up Blevins as the contact for the First Elder.
Yeah, no, it is. And again, it works instinctively. Even if you aren't paying attention to all those little sort of seemingly contradictory kind of dialogue references, our man and the FBI, when there may actually be two of them, or the kind of ambiguity about whether there's something going on at the Department of Defense versus, what the syndicate itself is doing. I like that it is easy enough to follow in those lines, and it works very well. Again, this is the thing with the X-Files. When you're telling a story like this, if your storytelling wasn't on point, and I don't mean just in terms of dialogue and exposition, I mean visually as well. Again, the way that the episode is shot and edited, the way in which it's framed, the way in which the way in which the story kind of leads you through these conclusions, as much through, kind of cuts and scene transitions and kind of framing as it does through actually having characters articulate what they're saying. It is really, really great. And people kind of forget that when they talk about the X-Files, when they talk about how wonderfully cinematic the show's direction was, particularly by the standards of network television kind of in the 90s. And in terms of just sort of what you were talking about there, kind of with the cigarette smoking man and the First Elder, and this is the thing where I have mixed feelings, because I really like Redux II, but I have mixed feelings about the death of the cigarette smoking man at the end. I think it's a wonderful death sequence. I think it's handled really, really well. I think it's surprisingly moving. And again, this is something you alluded to there when you talked about this idea of developing sympathy and compassion for the cigarette smoking man, because he has been presented as this big villain, as this monstrous figure, as this character who is, beyond redemption, at a point. But there's also something very sad in that shot of him as he's, dying or seeming to die, kind of reaching out to kind of touch the picture of Samantha and Fox, the family that he lost, the family that he kind of wanted to have to a certain extent, but never really got to connect with. And it's strangely moving to see him in that empty apartment trying to do that. But at the same time, I find myself a little bit cynical about the kind of death of the cigarette smoking man in Redux 2, because Carter wrote the Fight the Future, back in the 4th season during the Christmas break. I think he went to Hawaii with Frank Spotnitz to write it. He filmed it in the gap between the 4th and 5th seasons. He knows that William B. Davis is going to be back playing the role of the cigarette smoking man, by the end of the season. And, the audience knows or has some suspicion based on kind of reports and kind of cast listing and stuff like that the cigarette smoking man will be back. I mean, even in interviews around the same time, Davis, there's Davis, who's a fantastic interviewee. If you read any of the interviews with him, or even if you've read his book, was it Where There's Smoke? He's got this very strong personality that comes across very well. But this story of an interviewer asking him about his death in the kind of second part of the season premiere, and he says, "Ha ha ha, kill me for a couple of weeks, will they? I'll have my revenge." And I wonder, does this use of death with the cigarette smoking man, where it's transparently clear, even before he's hit the ground, that he's going to be coming back, it's not say, and I'm wary of spoilers for listeners who may be watching for the first time, but later on you have characters who appear to die but who come back later on, and it seems that was a result of the Carter and the writers going, actually, these were good characters, we like these actors, we should keep them around and do something with them. Here there's a sense of writing that scene knowing that it's not going to stick, knowing that the cigarette smoking man is going to be back. And I'm wondering, does that cheapen it in a way? Is it a very crass, is it a slightly cynical move from Carter to kill off, in inverted commas, the cigarette smoking man, knowing that he's going to be back by the end of the season? What do you think, Russ?
Yes. I agree. I totally do. I think they've already got the death of Blevins dramatically. Maybe it builds on what you were alluding to earlier with the analogy to the ending of The Godfather and needed more deaths. But they could have gone after Critchcow. They could have, if they wanted to have that dramatic build-up. I completely agree. I think this is one of the ways in which the mythology can alienate people.
Yeah.
It contrasts with, I think, the dramatic nuance of Scully's cancer arc, and instead goes for the cheap shot.
Quite literally.
It's unfortunate. In some sense, by the time we get to My Struggle 4, it's so campy that, like Chris Knowles will say, it's like Carter writing a comic book, and you can can be appealing at that level, but at this point in the story, it's disappointing. It's unnecessary. It's with a story that's trying to have so much gravitas and I think even emotional, or we could even say socio-cultural, political truth to it, that it does that. It's probably the weakest part of the episode for me.
Yeah, it is, and it's kind of funny that you mentioned comic books, because again, when Joe Harris kind of brought the X-Files back for comics for IDW, for season 10, one of the things that he did was he brought back all of these kind of classic Syndicate fan favorite characters. And again, that's something that you see in comic books all the time. It's around this time you had the death and resurrection of Superman happening in DC Comics in order to bump up sales. And, you had this idea, I think a couple of years later, where Marvel were saying that they would kill one major character every quarter in order to drive up sales and kind of drive fan engagement. And it does feel a little bit cynical, and it does feel a little bit calculated. And it's a shame because, I do also like the death, one of the cigarette smoking man's future death sequences. I think two of the others are maybe less than convincing, but the next one I really, really do like. And I really like this death scene as well. And part of me wonders, would it have been better for this to be the end of the cigarette smoking man, even though his popularity and his ubiquity and the fact that, he was arguably, in the 90s, a pop culture villain on par with Darth Vader. And you can actually see that in the way that they developed the character, as the Dark Father to the, Campbellian hero at the heart of the narrative. But, he was doing the cover of TV Guide, he was doing interviews and press for the show, he was instantly recognizable, he was the only character apart from Mulder and Scully to appear in the Simpsons crossover episode, even if he, wasn't voiced by William B. Davis. And I wonder if, would the show have been better if the cigarette smoking man had died and stayed dead here, do you think? Or, should they never even have tried to kill off the smoking man and just accepted that he was always going to be part of the show?
Maybe I'm going to be a curmudgeon and say this: if you're going to do it and leave it down. That was one of the issues of a show running that long. As many different ways I love the X-Files, the death resurrection trope was way too played out, but yet in other areas it wasn't. So, like X, we didn't get to see X again, and I would have liked to see X again. If I'm going to be a comic book fan, that's one of my favorite characters. So there are a lot of deaths that stick, and it's not really justified or explained why CSM keeps surviving. Especially, if we look at going from the truth to My Struggle. Yeah, you have to go into fantasy comic book land, and that's fine. But even from here, how many times this has happened? And it hurts because of a lot of the other stories they're trying to tell, and the feel of the alleged authenticity of the mythology episodes. I know we're talking about aliens, we're doing all the rest, but they're very grounded, contrary to a lot of the other X-Files episodes. And to do it in this context, if they would have killed him in something like Musings Like a Cigarette Smoking Man, where you're having an unreliable narrator, they could use narrative tricks like that to kill him, and then he's not dead. But I think at this point, most everything that had been done with the character that's interesting had been done. There's a few other good episodes that come on, and I'm not going to knock those that come later. And again, William B. Davis is a very entertaining actor, and it's already season 5. They were planning, I think, originally wrapping up the show around the end of season 5, season 6, originally for Carter's Point, because we're getting into Patient X, Red and the Black pretty soon anyways. And the fact that continues past that, this attempt to reboot this mythology, but yet you're keeping the main salient figure representing it, it's disappointing. Yeah,
it's a kind of a tension that's unbearable. But again, this speaks to kind of one of the tensions within the show, particularly as it became so popular, because it was so iconic. You can tell that there are actors or characters even, but I imagine actors as well, that the production team like working with and characters that they like writing for. And so they keep them around well past arguably their sell-by date. I would argue that Alex Krycek, for example, has no reason to stay around as long as he does in the second second half of the series. Because, like you pointed out, a lot of the stuff that you can do with him has already been done. But it just seems like they enjoy having that character go back and forth. Same thing happens with, like, and again, you could see it even in Redux itself with Skinner, where the writers have kind of struck gold and understand that Mitch Pileggi does, like, conflicted and ambiguous really well. So what you end up doing is you keep going back to the well and you keep reiterating the same arcs and the same beats over and over again in a way that, you know, that diminishes them through repetition. And I mean, you could arguably even see that with, say, Scully's Cancer, where even like in the fifth season itself, where you have, like, between Memento Mori and kind of Redux and like Emily, there's a sense of the show going back to particular wells maybe once too often. And it does feel a little bit cynical. And the death of the cigarette smoking man, as much as I love the scene and the sequence and the editing and the composition, even that shot of him reaching out for the picture of kind of, you know, Mulder and Samantha, I feel like even watching it for the first time, I would have loved that scene so much more if I actually believed it, you know? If I actually believed that they were going to commit to this. If this was going to be the last time that I saw this actor, that sequence would have more meaning and more depth to me. But that again, you know, this I worry that I'm being kind of overly negative, because I do generally like Redux 2 a lot, but that's the bit that kind of sticks in my craw a little bit. That's the bit where I go, really, was that the best kind of thing that you could come up with? I mean, it feels like Carter's being cheeky, because he knows as well as we know that there's no way this will stick. And it just seems, because it's not like, you know, they killed him off and then realized it was a mistake and brought him back. They have him in the movie that they know they're releasing next summer. There's absolutely no way that anybody's going to let him stay dead for even a year. He remarks himself, you know, he was back by the 14th episode of the season in when he's writing about it. It just, yeah, it is one of those things where it feels... And you could argue maybe Carter's being clever or self-aware, or he's drawing attention to the trope. I don't necessarily buy that emotionally. I don't think it works thematically. It does feel cynical in an episode that otherwise is, I think, very smart, very clever, and is doing a lot of things that I think are worth doing.
I don't think you're being too cynical at all, or critical. Going back to yours and Tony's discussion about Gethsemane, and how well reasoned. I really appreciated that episode, you both talking about it, and your argument of really the justification for the alleged death of Mulder in that episode, and the cultural context for why that was done. And I'm sold on it. It makes the episode really work for me, having that interpretation. And, I mean, case in point, you haven't been able to do the same for this death. And... yeah. And unfortunately, the more we look at it, the more crass it looks. And because they were able to do it in Gethsemane, or we have all of these other pseudo-reality Darren Morgan / Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man triangle, alternative universe models, that if they needed that death, they could do it. It makes it more grating and bothering. Yeah, it doesn't ruin the episode, but it's disappointing. And like you said with the cancer thing, and the Emily and the rest, it is a bit overplayed. And that's unfortunate, because we're getting some really nice moments from these actors. And I think you're right that they're tempted to go back to these roles. Like Nick Lee is unbelievably charismatic in those roles.
He is.
Yeah. And I can't begrudge them the slightest, but at least they use him sparingly. And they don't...
He pops up once or twice a year, yeah.
Yeah, and there's not like, oh, Krychek's dead, and it's this big thing like they're doing here. It's just comes in and out, a little scamp, a little rapscallion action, and exit left stage, and everybody's happy. I mean, that's fun. Yeah. It's fun. It's like pantomime.
But yeah, let's talk about things that we like about the episode. Kind of, like a reverse compliment sandwich. No, actually like a compliment sandwich. But I mean, because one of the things that I do actually like is, and we touched on it a couple of times, but it's probably worth coming back to to take a big chunk out of it, is that sequence in the diner with the Tabasco sauce. But the sequence with Samantha, which again is one of those things that if you were cynical, it could be very similar to what they're doing with the cigarette smoking man. Because, you know that Samantha is not going to be reunited with Mulder permanently in the 5th season premiere. Because at the very least, it would happen towards the end of the season. If this, and at the end of the last season, at that, you would assume. But at the same time, the sequence works, or at least it works for me, because it kind of gets at the kind of the thematic dynamics at the heart of kind of Redux 1, Redux 2, and Gethsemane, which is this idea of doubt and uncertainty. I mean, you have the wonderful observation from William P. Davis, where he was interviewed at the end of the season, and he remarked that he had no idea whether or not that was the real Samantha, and was quite surprised when he overheard a fan saying, "Oh, by the way, that wasn't the real Samantha." His response was, "Huh?" But you have this kind of sense of this wonderful kind of like centering of Mulder's quest for Samantha as a quest that is as much about him as it is about her, if that makes sense. And I think one of the things that I really like about the scene is that it confronts Mulder with this answer to the quest for Samantha that he hasn't quite anticipated, which is the idea that Samantha has another life, that Samantha has moved on, that Samantha has, in her own way, gotten over the trauma that she has experienced and has tried to construct a life for herself. There's the moment where, like, he's with her in the diner, and again, Duchovny is amazing, but he's trying to hold on to her physically and emotionally, and she's telling him that I don't want to remember Fox. I don't, I have another life. I have children of my own. And it's a powerful moment, the please let me go, both literally and figuratively, which is a gut-wrenching moment, particularly as it's played by Duchovny. But it's also like just the way in which it contrasts what Mulder has done, which is he's taken the disappearance of Samantha and built it into like almost a pathology. It defines almost everything about him, from the way in which he reacts to victims throughout the run of the show, even in standalone episodes. I mean, it's something that comes up in Oubliette, to pick an example as well. You have this idea of like Mulder's belief in the paranormal, his belief in aliens, his desire to be reunited with Samantha no matter what it costs him. Like he's very, like he's cited earlier in this very episode in conversation with Bill, the loss of Samantha as something that is foundational to him, something that is core to him, something that is kind of like a defining attribute of who he is. And you have him confronted with the idea of, well, what if somebody who was on the exact opposite end of that kind of like divide, of that break, of that trauma, what if that person moved on with their life? What if that person got over their suffering? What if Samantha buried that pain that she felt? She kind of like, and again, this gets back to that Carter idea, and I don't want to call it evil, because it's not evil, but it's that idea of complacency, the idea that to live in the world, or to live in a world that exists, that's built on so much, not to get overly kind of like left-wing, kind of, sort of like, social, cultural, Marxist or whatever about it. But
do it, Darren.
Do it. You're the voice inside my head. You're the kind of Luciferian figure here, Russ. But the idea.
So sweet of you.
Thank you. I always know just what to say. But the idea that living in a world that, as outlined by Krischgau in the previous episode, this idea of a world where the US military has become this kind of sprawling force, where the business of America is not business, it's war, where we're all subject to the whims of kind of like governments and kind of lies and kind of overarching kind of like structures, capitalism, to pick an example. But, the idea of kind of, neoliberalism, globalization, all these other forces, the invisible hand, this idea that like our lives that we live those lives of comfort, by turning a blind eye to the suffering of other people, to the fact that, the current, the world in which we live, which is, at the time in the 90s was peaceful and stable, was built on horrors and atrocities and kind of destruction and death. As Krischgau points out, nobody in America had any stomach for looking at the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and kind of seeing, the Pax Americana, the birth of the American century. So, you construct this kind of elaborate kind of defense, this denial, in order to protect yourself from that. And you have Samantha doing that in Redux II. You have the idea that Samantha has been through the same process that Mulder has been through. She's lost her family. She's been separated from them. She's suffered immensely. But she's been offered a deal by the cigarette-smoking man, which is, you can have a normal life. You just have to blind yourself to the reality of what you've experienced and what you're living in. You just have to compromise. You just have to accept the way that things are. And she's taken that. She's taken the deal that Mulder can't bring himself to take. And there's something very powerful in that. In the idea that, you know, Mulder has this quest searching for Samantha. But here he's confronted with the possibility that Samantha has never really been searching for him, that she's never really felt a need or a yearning, that she's never felt the same motivation towards truth that he felt, that she, in inverted commas, got over it and he didn't. And there's something very powerful in that. And again, this ties back into, you know, people call it the Redux trilogy. I quite like calling it the Gethsemane trilogy because it ties into that idea of doubt and questioning and uncertainty. Because Mulder's confronted in that moment with the prospect that how he responded to his formative trauma was not the only way to respond to it, and was not even perhaps the healthiest way to respond to it. Because what if Mulder had responded to that trauma like Samantha? What if he had kids of his own? What if he had a life? What if he didn't have a quest that had led to a situation where his partner was dying in hospital as a result of decisions that he had made, having been taken in the second season as a way of leveraging against Mulder in order to kind of keep him under the thumb of the syndicate. And I find something very powerful in that, very emotional, very thematically rich, but also very rich in terms of character. And again, it's something Carter comes back to. Like, again, not to get too spoiler, in the sixth season in, Two Fathers and One Son, you have this idea of Mulder kind of facing that choice again. The question of, like, do you throw in? Do you accept the way that things are? Or do you continue, like, knowing that you're probably going to fail, knowing that you're not necessarily going to accomplish anything particularly meaningful, but because your faith and your belief and your quest has value of itself. I find that sequence a phenomenally powerful piece of television.
I think I would have liked to have you in the writer's room on that. Because there are a few moments in their conversation that I think don't ring as true because it's so rushed. And that if we could have let it breathe a little bit more...
Yeah, that's fair.
Because the ideas you're all talking about, that makes sense. I mean, that's there. And it should be... Some of it's foregrounded so much that there's some of the issues, like the fact that she's surprised he's still alive. I'm being distracted by these sorts of things. And then they get in, they get out, and they disappear. And it just becomes another temptation by the CSM. And so Samantha as a character in that world, in that hypothetical situation you're talking about, that she's made this choice to be blind, is not realized, isn't manifested in a way that feels three-dimensional to me.
That's very fair, because it is literally only a scene. It's a cliffhanger, go to commercial break, and then it's a scene. I do think, though, that there is something in there she talks about how she didn't want to come here at all, which kind of perhaps explains why she never found Fox, because she didn't really look, if that makes sense. I can buy that. Sorry.
Sure. Oh, no, it totally makes sense. Your argument is correct. Your interpretation and how you put it out, the way you've constructed that scenario and how it analogizes with everything else makes wonderful sense. I'm not arguing against that at all. I just think it doesn't come across, and it isn't utilized to the degree that I wish it were. And then we talk about how much time is spent watching somebody assemble a sniper rifle and the death of the CSM as the dramatic arc. Considering, I think it could have been nice to, instead of that, cut away to Samantha living her life at the end and just having her be there and talking about that, if it were real or if it was a clone or whatever else. We could still keep it ambiguous. That, I think, would have been a better bookend than CSM's death.
Yeah.
Because it would also then mirror so nicely with Scully's situation with her family and Bill Mulder and all of the rest. But so you basically just convinced me that there's another story that needs to be a Redux Part 3.
I mean, to be fair, again, some of that is admittedly like interpretive and stuff like that. And again, a lot of it's down to the fact that you can And again, yeah, I am admittedly maybe filling in more blanks than it really deserves. Because again, what I think about when I see that sequence with Samantha is I think about, and it's weird because I know that these parts were written by Duchovny rather than Carter when you get to Amor Fati, but like the sequences of Mulder's life in suburbia. The last temptation of Mulder that you get at the start of the 7th season. And I imagine Samantha's life being a lot like that. And again, a lot of that is interpretive. There's very little here to actually support that outside of the quick line, oh, I have kids and I didn't want to come here. And I never really thought about it that much. But I kind of like within the kind of context of Carter's kind of recurring themes, the show's recurring themes, for me, it makes sense. I do admit it's a reach. It is absolutely, definitely a reach based on a single 2-minute scene of dialogue.
I think you're misinterpreting me. I got to work on my language. I don't think it's necessarily a reach. I think it's a wonderful interpretation. I think it makes a lot of sense. Where my concern is, I wish I like it so much, and I think it's legitimate. I think it's a legitimate assumption to make on your part too. I wish that more time was spent to allow that to breathe and become more emotionally resonant.
Yeah,
just have some time for it to be there. No, this is how contrary I am. I'm trying to compliment this wonderful interpretation, and it comes across as a dismissal.
No, not at all. I'm worried that we're agreeing far too much, that we're not getting kind of combative enough when it comes to sort of like to make good podcasting radio. No, I agree entirely. I agree entirely with regards to the fact that there isn't enough time there. And again, you're right that there's some stuff that probably could have been cut to make room for it. And again, there's a sense of a lot going on here, and I kind of admire how much Carter tries to cram in here. And again, this just makes me slightly more frustrated, and I feel sorry to kind of allude to a conversation that I know you haven't heard yet, but to, myself and Tony's conversation about how much of Redux 1 is spent walking through grey corridors, when you have so much story concentrated here, and you're like, well, you could just have doubled the time that you spent with Samantha, and that would get you a significant portion of the way home. You could spend more time on that, and that would be arguably much more interesting than, Mulder and Scully's purple prose, overlaid across Mulder walking through grey corridors with red doors in them. But just in terms of this episode, is there anything else you want to talk about? Anything that's kind of like jumped out? Because I know we jumped around the episode a lot. I'm worried we kind of missed something.
Well, I've got a few other categories, but one in particular. But I would agree to hit that last point you're talking about. It's like when you did the discussion about the blessing way in the mix of the other two and how much time is spent on the resurrection ceremony and all of the problematic indigenous stuff. I couldn't agree more with that point too as well. Yeah, I Redux 1, I get that they're trying to do the build up and then they're going to do takedown here, but they could have cut half of it out and built that up, so that would be nice. But to keep things moving along, one thing I'd like to get your thoughts on is the Bill Scully Mulder dynamic in this episode and some of the conversations. I quite enjoyed quite a few of them. They were a bit brutal, considering how understated some of them were. What are your thoughts about that whole conflict?
Well, I mean, this is the thing where Mulder is our protagonist, and so we've kind of spent time with Mulder, and we are predisposed to agree with Mulder in these situations. And it doesn't necessarily help that, like, the only extended interaction that we've had with Bill, given his scenes were cut from Memento Mori, are in Gethsemane at the dinner table where he's making terrible jokes. But at the same time, Bill Scully is perfectly reasonably correct here in his assessment of Mulder. Like, everything that he says about Mulder is... And I love Mulder very much, to be absolutely clear, and I think Bill Scully is a jerk, but everything that Bill Scully says is entirely on point and entirely reasonable and entirely fair. And I think what's more interesting about the dynamic is that Mulder accepts that. Like, the sequences where Mulder and Bill Scully are interacting, Mulder is a little bit combative. He's a little bit cheeky, a little bit dismissive. The bit where, they have that conversation. And again, this ties into that theme of ambiguity, but where, Bill asks, you really believe this crap, don't you? And Mulder says yes. And Bill explains that, she's your big defender. I think the truth is she doesn't want to disappoint you. And Mulder kind of cynically replies, but in a very kind of calm, very quiet way, not really that assertive, that if it works, I don't care what you think she thinks, which is that layer of ambiguity where nobody really knows anything about what's going on inside another person's head. But like even within that, when kind of Bill lays into him for his little green aliens, Mulder doesn't do the smart-ass thing of saying, well, actually, they're grey. reportedly, or being smug or dismissive or whatever. He just kind of sits there and takes it, perhaps because he thinks he kind of deserves it. Here's an interesting thing for you, Russ, and I'm kind of wary about like listeners who, maybe haven't watched Millennium for this, because I know you have. I'm wondering if, right, the first season finale of Millennium Paper Dove, and light spoilers for a series of television that listeners might not have missed, so very quickly going to say this in as ambiguous a manner as possible. But the female lead of the first season of Millennium, at the end of it, something happens. There's a trauma. Her family has just been introduced as characters on the show. And I'm wondering if Carter had planned to carry that over to the second season with a sequence very similar to what we get with Bill, Scully and Mulder here, where Catherine's family sort of hold Frank to account for what has happened. Now, Morgan and Wong, who had taken over writing duties on the second season of Millennium because Carter had to focus on Fight the Future and the fifth season of The X-Files, they don't take the show in that direction. But part of me wonders if the Bill Scully and Mulder dynamic that we get in Redux II is Carter kind of like transposing that idea over from Millennium into the X-Files. And you see him do it quite a bit over the course of the show. So, particularly over the course of the fifth season. So, like, you see, for example, a lot of the pilot in The Red and the Black and Patient X, the sequence where people have kind of cut their eyes shut or kind of sewed their eyes shut, their mouths shut, and are kind of like set on fire walking through trees, which is a visual that he employs kind of in the big mythology episodes in the second half of the fifth season. Part of me is wondering if that Bill Scully and Mulder dynamic owes a bit of a debt to where Carter might have been taking Millennium in its second season, or am I reading too much into it?
I don't think you are. I think you even mentioned this on The Time Is Now, the Millennium podcast. Check it out, folks. It's great. That comes back around in season 3 of Millennium.
Yeah.
Back when Carter has a little bit more of a hand.
Creative reign.
Yeah. I think it could be. It could go two different ways. It could be the fact that this is something that interests him, I think similar to looking at the non-traditional masculinity of his male protagonists, or it also, there's the idea, to play devil's advocate, is that the storytelling kind of calls for it.
Yeah, that's fair as well.
That what has happened to Scully's family, and you think there needs to be some reckoning with it at this point that hasn't been done. But, so I think it could be both. I think it could have inspired.
It's worth noting that Bill Scully, was also introduced in Memento Mori, and when his scenes were cut, he was reintroduced in Gethsemane, which would imply that Carter had always planned a use for him. And I suspect that this is the use for him, given that, this is... I don't think he appears after this, does he?
I don't think so.
Yeah, so this is like the payoff for Bill Scully, basically. He does appear in A Christmas Carol and Emily as well. But yeah, so I feel like this is kind of like we're getting towards the end game of Bill Scully. I feel like his appearance in Gethsemane is Chekhov's pump-action shotgun of the Scully family dynamics.
You do highlight something here about Carter's interest in family dynamics, in drama and responsibility and accountability, and something that I really admire about his writing.
I do as well. I think it works very well, and I think it works well to have an outsider kind of come in and say that about Mulder, because again, we have that sense of we're aligned with Mulder's perspective. We have been kind of following Mulder throughout, and again, myself and Tony kind of alluded to this last week when we talked about Redux 1, where like if you step outside the like Mulder's narrative perspective for the purposes of Redux 1 and Redux 2, there's a lot of questions to ask about, like even the mechanics of like what he does with Osloff's body, and kind of how that works, and kind of like what he's thinking, and like what his thought process is when he has the dead body to immediately go to, well, I will shotgun his face and kind of use his swipe card to get into the DOD. And there's a sense of like, I don't think that Redux 2 steps as far outside Mulder as it can. I think that it would be perfectly reasonable for Skinner, for example, to ask, what the hell were you thinking? What was your thought process when you did that stuff? But I think that having Bill Scully kind of lay that out in a broader, more general way to make the point that Scully is suffering for Mulder's sins. And again, this is something that I think the show actually deserves a reasonable amount of credit for this, to be fair to it. In the second season, I think, the decision to have Scully abducted in order to teach Mulder a lesson was maybe not the best decision that the writers could have made, because it's one of those, put Scully in peril to teach Mulder a lesson. It's not exactly fridging a female lead, but it's close enough. It's the idea of using the suffering of a female character to add emotional leverage to Mulder. And I think that one of the great things about what the show did after that, particularly in the third season, was it found a way to take that trauma which narratively had been used to enrich Mulder's character, and then retroactively kind of used it to become this kind of feminist critique of kind of systems of power and structures and of men trying to assert control over women's bodies, but also allowing Scully her own autonomy and her own kind of self-determination in how she deals with that was also very clever. But I feel like it's also entirely appropriate to make the point, as the show does here, almost as a point of self-criticism, to say, actually, yes, Mulder, this is all your fault. It's fair to point out that the collateral damage of your Campbellian heroic arc, your quest for the truth, your desire to kind of like shine a light into the darkness and kind of validate all your crazy theories, like have actual consequences for people who are not you. Bill Scully, apologies, has lost, he's already lost Melissa to this. He's possibly going to lose Scully to it. It is perfectly reasonable for him to attack you for that, to make that criticism of you as a character. And I think it's fair, and I think it's actually quite a. And again, you joke about you overusing the word ambiguous. I probably overused the word brave. I think it's a very fair point for the show to make, and I think it's a very legitimate bit of almost self-criticism for the show to make in its handling of Scully's arc, but also in kind of self-awaredly kind of engaging with Mulder's own heroic arc and his own desire to be the hero of his story, and the idea that like being a hero means accruing massive collateral damage, because if you are the most important person in a narrative, you are largely untouchable, because obviously if you get removed from the narrative, it's no longer your narrative and the narrative ends up misformed. But if the storyteller wants to hurt you or wants to demonstrate the consequences of what you're doing, it's other characters who suffer in order to demonstrate to you that there is a cost. And so is that kind of, and again, this is the thing where the show is kind of being self-aware and being playful and being kind of engaging with big ideas. And like not even big ideas in terms of like this idea of like how we relate to government and authority, but even big ideas in kind of how we tell stories and how we construct stories. I like that the show kind of suggests that Mulder should be held to account for some of this, and that it's fair to call him out to an extent. So I like the Bill Scully stuff.
To build on all of that, what you said is that, yeah, it is maybe a little playful, but I think it's done so deftly.
Yeah.
And that Mulder, when we're introduced at the beginning of Redux II, is acting like he's throwing a tantrum and is completely out of control. Yeah. And unregulated, and it allows us to kind of get outside of his perspective a little bit and just see some of that behavior for what it is. And then the interaction, like you mentioned, where Bill says, "What, little green aliens?" And he, like you said, he would do something really smart, alecky, but he's been beaten down to this point to where, or he's grown, I guess would be a better way, where he can actually recognize some of this and has to reckon with it. And then maybe again similarly self-addressing, being metatextual, is that Scully is presented with all of these instructions from her doctor, Mulder, and Bill. So these three men,
all men, by the way,
three, and she says, "I'm going to decide. I'm a doctor," and then she ends up being cured. So in the sense of these people are trying to support, and Mulder does it, but we don't know. She's the one that ultimately makes the decision. And the way that it's done is very smooth. Major credit to Kim Manners on this episode, but then also it's some of the finest work by both Duchovny and Anderson.
Yeah. And
Anderson really doesn't get a lot of time, but what she does with the time she's given is exceptional.
Again, this is very similar to we talked about, like, you keep bringing back Krychek because Nick Lee does that very well. You keep making Skinner ambiguous because Mitch Pileggi does that really well. Like, the show does occasionally keep putting Scully in hospital because Anderson plays that kind of wonderful combination of vulnerability and strength. incredibly well. Like, I mean, she won an Emmy largely off the back of Memento Mori, and you can see that. It's an incredible performance. And again, the scenes with herself and Duchovny are really, really great. I've described myself as shipping agnostic, but you can see in the Redux trilogy just how much the show hinges on the two of them being able to share a scene together. You point out even the small scene, even a scene that, you know, in another show would be overplayed and melodramatic and heightened and full of yelling and shouting. You know, the sequence where, you know, if it was the wrong thing to do, you'd talk me out of it, which is this wonderful expression of how much the characters mean to each other, but which is played pitch perfectly by Duchovny and Anderson bouncing off one another. And I think you're right about Mulder's maturity here, that because it is... He's giving Bill Mulder what he thinks Bill Mulder needs in allowing him to be... Sorry, Bill Scully, apologies. He's giving... Too many Bills. He's giving Bill Scully what he thinks Bill needs, which is the idea to use him as a punching bag. And he also, later on in the episode, gives Scully what he thinks she needs, where she's, you know... He literally says to her, "Say a prayer for me," and we know that Mulder is atheist, is avowedly atheist. He's like confrontationally atheist, but like in that moment, he's acknowledging Scully's faith as something that not only does he tolerate, but something that he actively encourages, and something that he sees as having value of itself, and something that is, you know, something that her faith has value to him. Not value to him, not in a cynical way, but in terms of her belief in him is something that has value, and how she expresses that is it's kind of like is important and has value of itself. So Mulder doesn't believe in God, but he will still ask Scully, and I think he's being entirely serious. He jokes later on about the priest, a few Hail Mulders, but he does say a prayer for me, which implies that he believes that Scully praying for him has value or has worth, which is a lot. That's a pretty big character development for Mulder based on kind of like how we've seen him behave in the past around these ideas.
No, sorry, I think that's wonderfully put. And do you have any final thoughts on Redux 2 or the whole trilogy at this point that you'd like to?
Not really. I think we kind of actually talked through most of it. I really, really, really do like this trilogy. I adore Gethsemane. I think Gethsemane is the strongest of the three. And I do have very serious problems with Redux 1, as we talked about last week. But I really, really do like Redux 2, and I think it works really well. And I think the trilogy as a whole, while it's not always as successful as it would want to be, it is incredibly ambitious. And every time I watch it, I'm kind of struck by the idea of basically doing this at a point in time when your show is one of the most popular things on television, you know? And I admire the show, and I kind of love that. And one of the things I love about the X-Files and about Carter's writing in general is that he always swings for the fences. And even when he misses, and he does miss on occasion, and even when he doesn't hit it as far out of the field as you would expect, he's always doing his own thing. And this is very much Carter's own thing in a way that I am in awe of it. I think it has flaws. I think it has problems. I don't think it's the best mythology episode the show has ever, best mythology story that the show has ever produced. But it is something that I quite enjoy rewatching. I'm glad I got to revisit. So thank you, Russ.
No, thank you, and thank you, Tony, for letting me sit in. And yeah, like I said, I really appreciated the podcast you had on Gethsemane, because it really helped me to reappreciate this. Because I think where this lands in the series hurts it to some degree. There is a little bit of fatigue if you binge watch it by the time you get here. And if you can stop and just watch it as its own thing, there is, like you said, a lot to appreciate. And so it's been fun to explore this. During this rewatch, going along with the X-Cast, this is one of the episodes that I've really had or series of episodes, a trilogy, that I've had a major reappreciation of, thanks to going back and watching it through the perspective of everybody else. So that is fabulous. So now, on to the mailbag. We have a comment here, first from Stephen Levins. I hope it's Stephen and not Stefan. I apologize. Either way, Redux 1 and 2 are my second favorite entries in the whole show, besides Pusher. Controversial, sure, but so compelling, and Duchovny is incredible.
I can see that. I mean, again, like there's a lot of love out there for these episodes. I think I mentioned when we did Redux 1 that the entire trilogy won the fan poll for Thanksgiving 1999 to identify the best mythology episodes. So, you know, I mean, I have a qualified love for these. I kind of admire their ambition. I adore Gethsemane. And then I'm kind of on Redux 1 and Redux 2. I'm a bit kind of colder while liking Redux 2 a lot. But I admit that, you know, my affection for them is dwarfed by kind of how much is out there. And I think I can see that because there's a lot of really, really good stuff in here.
Yeah, and in this thread it opens up, there's a lot of people talking about, which we mentioned a little bit, as Duchovny's crying. And so Michael Little says he really brought his A game. And then Andrew Levitt, just because I don't have this here, especially when he eats Scully's hand.
Yes, that is a very strong choice from Duchovny. But it is, like, again, that's the thing. It's ugly crying, I think the kids call it, which is that willingness to be kind of open on camera and to actually, like, cry like a human being does, as opposed to crying like a beautiful person does. And Duchovny is a very beautiful person, don't get me wrong, but it's his willingness to be ugly when he cries, and to just sort of let that out, which is, again, it's something that is very, it kind of speaks strongly to him as an actor and to his commitment and to just kind of his willingness to go there. I really, really admire that about him. And it sounds really flippant when I say he's a beautiful crier, but he really is. It's very hard to sell. Like, it's really hard to communicate across how good he is at something that you imagine would be kind of fundamental to most actors.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the fact that he's taken those risks like Carter's with the script, like you mentioned, says something. In that scene at night with Scully's hand, I think it's beautiful because you don't see that in media, especially not on television. And like you said, for Duchovny to take a risk like that, I think it pays off. Some people here find it humorous, and I could see why he could, because it is such an intense swing for the fences, but I really applaud him for doing that. And yeah.
Well, that's it, because it's a risk. It is, like, opening yourself up to that is a risk creatively. You know, I mean, you have these stories about actors, like directors who work with actors who won't put deleted scenes on or kind of alternate takes or outtakes on the DVDs and Blu-rays because they feel like actors are less willing to take chances if there's a chance that somebody will see a bad take. You know, there's a sense of like an unwillingness to put yourself out there, like as a risk or to kind of turn yourself into a joke. And I kind of admire that, like, Duchovny, for all that, like, his screen persona is built on stoicism and underplaying stuff and kind of like being deadpan, that when you get these big emotional beats that he goes for it. As you said there, he swings for the fences. As the commentator said, he almost eats Scully's hand, which is, again, it's something that you could laugh at, you could be cynical about, but I kind of look at that and I go, that's a strong choice. And it's, not to get too open on a podcast, Russ. I mean, I like to think we know each other, we can be open, but I will freely admit that I have ugly cried, and it would probably look more like Mulder crying than it would, I don't know, Jennifer Aniston.
Yeah. And I think if somebody admit on a podcast that they've never ugly cried, I think we have mental health concerns. There is that vulnerability in it that is, there's a bit of fear. Not in the sense of, not just only in Mulder's portrayal, but even like talking about it in our culture. And it's sort of a joke in that sense. And that's problematic, both in the sense of for cultural health, mental health, but also just narrative and dramatic performance and the dramatic arts. And, kudos for that. And there's people, some comments in there talking about some of the cries that don't land so well, like Field Where I Died and the rest. But, yeah, I can't imagine how difficult it must be as an actor to sell something like that, especially with a character like Mulder. And again, maybe Scully's a little easier to cry, maybe just Anderson is so consistently excellent at it that it's... but also, Anderson is much more stoic. Not Anderson, I'm sorry, Scully is much more stoic. So I think it's a different thing. But I think it's an interesting thing to talk about. And it's goes back to the emotional intelligence of the show and what it tries to do at some points.
Yeah. I think the fact that, Duchovny is, the second best emoter on the show is not a knock on Duchovny so much as it's an acknowledgement of how phenomenally lucky they got with casting.
Oh, yeah. No arguments. We got a comment here from Kalechi Nulo, and I hope I got the last name pronounced correct. I think I've heard it a few times on other podcasts, but Hello, but I'm not sure if I got that right. Have to say, Redux 1 and 2 are my favorite two-parters from the show. Don't get me wrong, there's been some brilliant 2 and 3-parters, but this one is special. It's the build-up that gets me every single time, with everything on the line from Scully's health to Mulder's belief in the truth being tested. And here's something fun, that's me saying that. Also, loved that for once Mulder and Scully got to play the other side, in quotes, where they had a small window to play this conspiracy game, a.k.a. Mulder faking his death and being ahead of it instead of being the last ones to know. But for me, with all the twists and turns, it culminates in my favorite X-Files moment, where Mulder names Blevins instead of Skinner like a good old-fashioned courtroom drama. The scene never gets old for me and always leaves me on the edge of my seat. X-Files at its awesome best. I like this idea here about it being a little bit ahead of the game, in the sense that they're going to be the ones who've got the secret info on Blevins, hypothetically, and then also the death and the rest. Any thoughts about that?
Well, no, I think that is actually, that's something that I didn't get a chance to talk about with Tony last week and didn't really come up this week, and I think it's a very fair point that Kelechi brings up there, which is the idea that, yeah, what you have is you have Mulder and Scully almost weaponizing the kind of the weapons of the conspiracy against them, where they have this idea of lies. Because I think Mulder even mentions it in the voiceover in Redux 1, where what he's doing is he's using the same technique and the same craft that has been applied against him and against Scully in the past, which is this idea of like wielding deception as a weapon, and kind of uses that himself against the people who have used that against him for so long, which is very clever. I'm not entirely sure the show gets as much mileage out of that as it might. I think a lot of that is again, and this is something where I'm worried about treading on what I talked about with Tony last week, but the idea that, you know, the show, in order to get to the point where Mulder has, you know, shotgunned a guy's face off and kind of snuck his way into, the government lair, the heart of the government in the DOD, means the show has to move very, very quickly to avoid like anybody asking any, you know, too many uncomfortable questions, such as like, did Mulder bring a change of clothes to Scully's, or did he drag the body through the corridors into his apartment before he took the face off? And those sort of questions which could easily undermine the mechanics of the story being told. But I do think that there is something very interesting there, and I do think that I kind of almost, and like you said, you almost wish that you got more of the Samantha stuff, and I would agree with that. I almost wish that we did get more of that stuff where Mulder and Scully become conspirators themselves. And again, it ties into this whole, again, the whole postmodern self-aware thing that runs through the entire 3-parter, where the show is almost kind of doubling back on itself, or kind of like circling round, or kind of bending over, or kind of like contorting in interesting and weird ways. And I think that making Mulder and Scully kind of liars in order to help them entrap liars. And I mean, it's very telling that, like, at the end of the episode where Skinner asks, how did you know that it was Blevins? And Mulder's reply is, I didn't, which is quite cold, given the stakes of what's happening, in that if it wasn't Blevins, Mulder just signed some innocent guy's death warrant, because it's fairly clear that whoever he named was probably going to end up found dead as a, you know, suspected suicide at some point after the end of the episode. But it is something that I think is very clever and very interesting. I do wish the show got more mileage out of it. I do wish that with everything else going on in this 3-parter, that there was a bit more room to explore kind of what that meant, and whether there was any. And again, a lot of the ethics of what Mulder does here do get kind of like glossed over, in terms of what he does to Oceloff's body, for example, but even things like the naming of Blevins without having any proof, but without even having a strong moral belief himself behind it, seems like the show kind of almost gives him a bit of a pass on that one, again, because so much is happening so quickly. I do wish that there had been more space to develop that angle, actually, if we're being entirely honest.
Well, I think with that and the Melissa stuff we talked about, you know, make it a 4-parter, or really rework part 1 again, going back to what you were talking about. Yeah. So Katie Doe also agrees. This was the first episode I ever saw live after a summer of trying to catch up with reruns. So Redux 1 was. And that also we got a couple other people, in addition to her, talking about that courtroom, the naming scene of Blevo. Yeah. Seems to be very, very popular.
J'accuse!
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, so here's something I think we could get your opinion on. So Andrew Levitt Redux II is a masterstroke of an episode. So many things come to a head and are resolved here. Scully's cancer goes into remission, Mulder gets to see who he thinks is his sister, Skinner's allegiance is reaffirmed, and the Syndicate finally gets rid of that pain in their side, CSM. At least temporarily. Mark Snow's score is fantastic throughout.
Yeah.
A classic episode. I only wish we could have seen Mulder work for CSM temporarily, since it seems like a really intriguing storyline. Still, Mulder's instant refusal is totally in keeping with his character. Like that'd be a fun side thought there.
It is, but I don't see Carter going for that, because again, like, this is the thing where again we've kind of talked about Carter's morality elsewhere, but the idea that I think Carter tends to see things in more absolutes. I don't think he would have Mulder go along with that. I don't think he would have Mulder kind of join the conspiracy, even to possibly unearth them. I don't think he would compromise himself in that way. I think that's part of, like, what Carter finds romantic about Mulder. Like, I mean, there are moments where he comes very close. I mean, even here he talks about that sequence where, he talks with Scully about how he was ready to take that deal. How he was going to take that deal, and then he kind of changed his mind at the last minute. I think that's about as close as Carter will ever let Mulder get. It happens again in Two Fathers and One Son, and I think it's actually very interesting what Two Fathers and One Son does with Mulder's character, in particular how it deals with things like complicity and, like, when the chips are down, the choices that you make, and how those choices are kind of informed and shaped by immediate needs and by personal desire as much as by abstract concepts and principles. But I can't imagine an version of the X-Files where Carter would ever have allowed that. It's very similar to, again, Frank Black on Millennium, where I can't imagine Carter allowing what happens with Frank Black's character on the second season under Morgan and Wong, because I think Carter has a much stronger and old-fashioned idea of kind of heroism. That said, I do think that there is something interesting you could have done, and it's ironic that you mention working for the CSM. I think, and this is where we're getting into Darren's X-Files fan fiction, which is a giant cupboard that I keep in my house, but it's basically, I wonder if one of the great missed opportunities of the X-Files wasn't a 6-season episode focusing on Diana Fowley and Jeffrey Spender and their relationship with the cigarette-smoking man. And in particular, looking at it from the angle that was suggested there with Mulder. The idea that Spender, is maybe doing what he thinks is the right thing to do, but having to compromise and having to find that to do these things, he's put in uncomfortable positions, and for what he believes to be the greater good, he has to make compromises that he finds uncomfortable or distasteful. I think you could have done that story with Spender, and I think it would have worked thematically, particularly in kind of when we get to the context of his relationship with Mulder, both in terms of how the show positions him as a character, but also in terms of within the show's own mythology. I think you could have done stuff with that. I'm just not sure you could have done it with Mulder any more than I think you could have done it with Doggett.
Fair enough, and I love your fan fiction idea. I think that would be you laugh. You got to be nice to yourself, Darren. I think that'd be a fun story. I think it makes sense too. It could have been one of those give the main actors a rest episodes, like Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man, and not give too much away of the mythology, but just sort of like zero sum. Do something like that with those characters. Yeah. That'd be great. Yeah, I think it's an excellent idea.
Yeah.
Chandru Ravindran talks about... It's a fairly long comment, so I won't go to all of it, but read it on the board. It's great. Generally, recognizing Redux 1 is flawed, but has a lot of good stuff in it, and a lot of praise for Mark Snow's soundtrack. Redux 2 is a masterpiece, and mentions the similar flaws you were just talking about with the mole, and just naming Blevins and being lucky. And then Lone Gunman and Mulder not finding the chip in the last episode, so got some through line there. And also talks about the fact that Samantha wasn't emotionally ready to reach for Mulder. But the one thing I want to bring up out of the comment here, which I thought was fun, is, and who can forget about how excited Skinner is at the end? He's so giddy that Scully is okay and rushes into the hospital room. But the part that gets me is that he has this look to his face that says, "Oh my God, I'm so excited, I can't wait. Oh crap, her family is here. What the hell do I say? Do I small talk? I have no idea, so I'm just going to smile goofily and not say anything." Classic.
Yeah.
I kind of wonder what Skinner is like in social situations, because we know he's been married, right? We know he has a marriage behind him, but like he's always come across as such like a hard ass, or so compromised or in an uncomfortable position, or very aggressive and assertive. This is where you pucker up and kiss my ass. It's very hard to imagine Skinner making small talk. So I kind of love the idea of kind of the sitcom Scully family and Skinner kind of interaction that happened after there. Part of me also wonders if Skinner's like jubilation is not also partially related to the fact that he wasn't named by Mulder and therefore isn't likely to be murdered on his way back to his car this evening. I wonder if that might also be a factor in Skinner's relative jubilation at the end of the episode.
What a celebratory moment for him. But I do think at that point he's probably come down off the edge of hopefully not being murdered, because I'm assuming they've probably already found Blevins. So I'm going to go with Chandru here and just think it's his best attempt. Like, my hunch is that Scully and Mulder are probably like his two closest friends. Besides, like, somebody he like works out with, like whoever spots him when he bench presses, and like maybe shares a smoothie. Other than that, it's them.
It's dead zone. Well, I mean, you're at that age where you've stopped making friends really outside of work. And one has to imagine that, like, while Mulder and Scully kind of get all the crazy stuff that has happened to Skinner in the years kind of since he's managed the X-Files, all the other agents are a little bit weirded out by, you know, finding Amanda tapping dead in a bed next to him. And they're kind of like, well, okay, look, this is a bit weird and intense. Maybe just fill out the paperwork, you know, make eye contact, check in once or twice. Yeah, you know. You probably, if you're Skinner's agent and your boss has been like shot in a public restaurant, or like possibly implicated in a conspiracy to give one of his, you know, agents cancer, or has been infected by nanites, you probably want to steer. I can see Skinner not making friends. I can see it being very difficult for Skinner to branch out, you know, across the FBI at this age.
Oh, if only Sarah Blair could have been there to give him some moral support back then. But oh well. So we got a little discussion here with Caredwen Foley and Cathy Glinski talking about Mulder in hospitals. And so Cathy mentions Mulder screaming, "I will calm down when somebody gives me a reason to calm down." Is Mulder at his unreasonable best and perfectly sets the emotional tone for this episode. It's one of my favorites. And then Caredwen responds like this: "I'm sure I've said this before, but I could watch Mulder yelling in hospitals indefinitely." And then the moment where he sees her and his jaw drops and doubles over like he's been punched. Good Lord, that's powerful. So I know I ended there kind of on the more emotional beat, but I do like imagining there's like a DVD out there or a YouTube edit that somebody has this that's just 20 minutes of him rambling and raving in hospital.
Mulder shouting in hospitals. I do love that the episode opens with him in hospital as well. Like, it's the shot of him coming to the hospital shouting, so it kind of sets the pitch for what you're about to get, which is kind of great. I kind of, part of me just wants to wonder what it's like being in a hospital when Mulder shows up. How incredibly frustrating it is. Like, is our administrative staff, like, in Washington, D.C. on notice about Mulder? It's like, oh my god, it's him again.
Well, we've got a lot of good comments. There are so many people seem to really like this episode. I don't think I've seen this many comments in an episode for quite a while.
And understandably so. I mean, there is a lot to love here. Like, I mean, again, this is like pure iconic distilled X-Files. It's worth noting that when Frank Spotnitz came back to write, did he write 3 or 5 issues of the Wildstorm X-Files comic? He made a point to set it in the 5th season. Kind of the 5th season is the show's kind of golden age. It's kind of it's halcyon days, so to speak. I mean, when when you had Joe Harris going back and reviving the kind of conspiracy, a lot of it kind of harked back to the 5th season in terms of the show. And I'm trying to think, is it Resist and Serve, the video game? The one that was released afterwards. That's set sometime between the 5th and 7th season, if I remember correctly as well. So there's very much a sense of this being kind of peak X-Files, kind of this being like where, when you think of the X-Files, this is the time or point in the show that you think about, even more than, say, the 3rd season, which I would argue is perhaps stronger. But, this is kind of where it's at, and I can understand that. I can definitely understand that.
See, this seems to be a real popular episode. I recommend people go read the rest of the comments. And, yeah, thanks for sharing that, everybody. As we wrap this up, Darren, you have got at least 2 podcasts. We have the 250, which you talk about IMDb's top 250 and bottom 250, if I'm correct. Film.
Yes, top 250 and bottom 100. So yes, when this episode is releasing to patrons, our next episode will be a bottom 100 episode looking at Uwe Boll's 2003 inverted commas classic House of the Dead, where we've got Ethan and Jer from Disconnected Talk will be coming on to talk to us about that. If you're not a patron and you're listening to this live as it's released, we will hopefully be kicking off our winter of 1939 season to complement our summer of 1999 season earlier in the year. So the wonderful Carl Sweeney, who you may know from this particular podcast and others, will be joining us from the Movie Palace to talk about The Wizard of Oz, and we're really, really looking forward to that. We really hope you enjoy it.
That'll be fun. That'll be great. Yeah.
And it's and festive as well, actually, which is quite nice. Nothing says Christmas like The Wizard of Oz.
Does it?
You don't think of it as a Christmas movie?
No, and I'm saying that not in the sense that it shouldn't be, but I wonder if that's a cultural thing. Is it in Ireland? Is it considered a Christmas film?
It would always just be a film that's on at Christmas for us. We would always kind of associate it with Christmas. Now, again, maybe this is just my own family thing because it's my aunt's favourite movie ever. And so we would always watch it at Christmas. It's one of those things, it's like the Indiana Jones films. And again, I suspect that is a cultural thing for Irish people because our national broadcaster every Christmas will show the 3 Indiana Jones films and the 3 Back to the Future films staggered over the week between Christmas and New Year's, which is a delight, by the way. It is actually just really great. As somebody who has seen them far too many times, but will always put his feet up and stick on the television and watch them while munching on Christmas treats.
Wow. You got a cool country there, Darren.
We do indeed. I didn't see It's a Wonderful Life until I was like 18, which is very strange.
Don't tell Carl, but I actually still have never seen it. I need to, though, but let's keep that under wraps.
Okay, just you, me, and everybody listening to this podcast.
Oh, jeez, I forget about this whole internet thing. But that sounds like a lot of fun. And then what is coming up on the Scan-On podcast?
Actually, I've had to kind of step away from the Scan-On podcast just because there's so much going on. But that's still being run by the wonderful Jay Coyle, Ronan Doyle, and Grace Duffy. So they're still talking about Irish film week in and week out. It's very worth seeking out. I'd give it a wholehearted recommendation. And it's great because I'm not on it now. There's no conflict of interest. It's fantastic. Give it a listen, guys.
All right. And you've got that excellent book on the X-Files and also the one on Christopher Nolan. Any other fun projects that you want to share with the gang?
I should probably share I am doing 3 weekly columns at the Escapist magazine online, which is great. They've taken a huge sort of chance on me. I'm very, very flattered. Huge gambit on me as well. So I'm doing columns there Mondays, Fridays and Sundays, where I'll be taking a look at the week in geek news, so to speak. So taking a look at things like the new Watchmen TV show, stuff like the new Mandalorian TV show, and kind of like just taking a look at pop culture kind of in a more in-depth lens. I'm really, really happy with how it's turned out. People seem to be responding well to it. So yeah, if you want to check that out, I'm writing there. I'm also working at the Movie Blog, which is my own personal blog where I share reviews of everything that I've seen recently. We're getting into awards season, so there'll be a variety of stuff there. Far too many words, but that's great when you're one of the advantages of being your own editor. But no, if you want to find me online, I'm easy enough to find. Just give me a quick Google, Darren Mooney. I'll turn up. Thank you so much to everybody who has actually supported everything that I've done so far. I've been very, very lucky, and I admit that. So thank you all.
We're lucky that you actually have time to come on the podcast and record these things for us. So, as you and Tony have some strange, insane productivity skill. I don't know what it is, but maybe you need to start giving lectures on that too. How to finish things. Good grief.
The opposite of decaf. We full calf.
Oh,
recaf.
That's true. Yeah,
we use recaf.
Oh my gosh. I gotta change the sauce. As a final question, I'm curious, what was the worst film you saw all year?
Oh, this feels mean, but I'm going to answer it anyway. It is Polar, which is ironically, I think, one of the first films that I saw this year, which is available on Netflix. I don't know why I'm telling you where it's available, because it's awful. It is soul-destroying. It's basically Netflix, and again, no offense to Netflix, they've done some absolutely great stuff. The Irishman is amazing if you want to watch something on Netflix this Christmas. The Marriage Story by Noah Baumbach is really good. I'm not a huge Baumbach fan, but I quite like Marriage Story. But Polar is soul-destroying. soul-destroyingly terrible. It stars Mads Mikkelsen, and it's a knockoff of basically John Wick. It's bargain basement John Wick, and it is crass, it's vulgar, it's unfunny, it's overlong. It somehow feels cheap, despite the fact that you know that a huge amount of money was spent on it. And it's just, it's bad. It's really bad in ways that are like... We could spend another 2 hours having me articulate how awful it is. Let me just paint a picture for you. It opens with a sequence of Johnny Knoxville getting shot through the heart while receiving oral sex at the side of a pool. And it goes downhill from there.
Ouch. Well...
Yeah, there's a mental image.
Up until then, I was really glad I asked the question. And now I'm going to have to go back on the decaf. But no, fabulous, Darren. It has been, as always, an absolute delight and honor to speak with you. And I look forward to the next future informational dispensations that come from thy brain. So until then, everyone, the classic...
Trust no one. The Xcast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and hosted by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated team of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find the show on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the Xcast, or inside our group, the X-Files Basement, an Xcast podcast fan group, plus on Instagram by typing in the XFcast. If you're a fan of the show, why not support us on Patreon? Exclusive bonus episodes, early access to new episodes, plus become part of our Xcast community in the Patreon department. To see our monthly subscription options, just head to patreon.com/the Xcast. That's patreon.com/the Xcast. We'd love to see you join our Patreon community. We're also part of the We Made This podcast network at We Made This Pod on Twitter and We Made This on Facebook. You can find a range of shows on TV, film, music and popular culture in general on the network. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.